Hello, I am Mary Mason, President of the Friends of Old Dover. The Dover Days Committee, along with the Friends of Old Dover, also known as the Historical Society of Dover, are pleased to offer you a virtual celebration of our city's heritage. Dover Days began in 1933 by Mabel Lloyd Ridgely as a day with the storied houses and gardens of Old Dover. Through the years, the Dover Days has grown into a lively festival with parades, maypole dancing, historic reenactions, community speakers, and food and craft vendors organized by the Dover Days Committee. Due to the ongoing restrictions of the COVID pandemic, we will celebrate again this year with a series of online lectures on topics such as pre-colonial history, Victorian architecture, religion, ethnic groups, education, horticulture, and social history of Dover. We are proud of our traditions, and our focus is on preserving Dover's historic and architectural heritage for future generations. We hope you enjoy our online program. The Dover Days Committee and the Friends of Old Dover look forward to spending Dover Days with you in person the way it used to be next year. A special thank you goes to the students of the ARVED, Audio, Radio, Video Engineering Design of Caesar Rodney High School for their assistance with this program.
Happy Dover Days. The story of our history tends to focus on the colonial period, the Revolutionary War, and the Victorian era. But a few talks today go beyond these two eras. Of course, Dover was here since the very beginning of our country's history. And I'm going to talk about one that is from an era that's about 100 years ago, the era of Prohibition. The Friends of Old Dover are working on a walking tour later this year where we may go more in depth on the subject of the Roaring Twenties, but today the focus is going to be on Prohibition. The story of Prohibition and the country and Delaware is, of course, about one of the great social experiments in our country's history. It was a journey that really began at the beginning of our country's founding and came about because of the social and economic changes that started in the 19th century. It was a recognition of a serious social problem of alcohol that was both a result and a cause that turned out worse than the disease. It is also a story of people, not just Al Capone, but the everyday people who were on both sides of this issue. That is very typical in American history, a practice that was common, changing times and social upheavals, community outrage, and quick, decisive action, and a cure that seemingly turned out worse than the original problem. Alcohol use has always been part of the American culture, even before there was an America. In fact, alcohol, or the lack of it, was one of the first issues the Pilgrims had up the coast in Plymouth, Massachusetts, had back in 1621. Back then, for a variety of reasons, alcohol was essential to everyday life. For one thing, alcohol was considered much safer than water. Back in Europe, due to a lack of knowledge about sanitation, a lot of the water supplies were contaminated. The process of brewing or distilling tended to, as we know today, make beer and wine safer to drink. This was due to several factors, such as the brewing process of heating the water, ingredients like hops, antiseptic properties of alcohol, and the natural acidity of beer and wine made it a safer, and I may say tastier, beverage to drink. It was an absolute necessity on ship voyages, as even the best water would go bad eventually due to naturally occurring pathogens. In fact, ships carried more alcohol than water. A ship that delivered more pilgrims to Boston in 1630 shipped with 3 times as much alcohol as water. And of course, there were the other effects of alcohol. It warmed the person on cold nights, it made hard labor easier to bear, and it was used for medical purposes. It was a social lubricant. and it aided a digestion in an era where food was probably even more questionable than the water. The culture then was certainly very pro-alcohol, and even more so pro-beer. Beer was the most common drink in England, and while there was wine and spirits, they generally preferred malt and hops, which of course was not available in the New World. And the earliest colonists, because of the shortage of alcohol, tried to make all sorts of beer-like beverages, using things like pumpkins and parsnips, persimmons, spruce tree, with flavoring coming from things like walnut chips. And while alcohol is alcohol, it wasn't the same as old world beer. These strange combinations tended to open the window for harder drinks and backyard stills. Local grain and fruit were, of course, readily available and could more easily create a more consistent and potent drink that also had the advantage of being easier to transport and more profitable. And while beer has always remained popular, harder liquor had its advantages in that it led to a somewhat diminished popularity of beer as the taste of hard stuff developed. Early in our country's history, alcohol was a mainstay of the family table, with beer or cider being shared by all, even children. And very little work in the community was accomplished without a liquor ration. Be it a barn raising, a muster, clearing common areas, or building the town hall or the church, a keg of alcohol was always there to help motivate and reward those who were working. And it was a reward hard-earned, and it was needed. That work was long and hard, and the drinking was generally done throughout the day in short pulls from a drug to help deaden the pain of the back-breaking work. And while drinking on the job may seem dangerous, the type of labor that was being done and the more constant consumption rather than drinking in bursts tended to not jeopardize safety or others' productivity, as it may do today. In addition, the strong community ties tended to rein people in, with churches and magistrates ready to just step in, with exhortations and sermons. When that didn't work, fines, the stock, jailings, and fines tended to rein people in. It is the backdrop that America developed a certain appetite and tolerance for drink. By the 1790s, after independence, the per capita consumption was about 3 gallons of absolute alcohol a year, and it would wind up peaking in 1830 with about 7 gallons of alcohol per person. For comparison, we drink in America today about 3 gallons per person, more like our post-colonial era. However, 7 gallons of pure alcohol per person would actually mean about the equivalent of 90 bottles of a standard 80 proof alcohol a year for every adult in the United States. Taking into account that not everyone drank, that's a lot of alcohol. The shift away from tolerance toward prohibition started pretty early, and it was driven by industry and religion. We had some very early leaders in colonial America, like Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration, who was writing on the evils of drinking, but it had very little effect. However, religious groups got involved early. The Methodist Church took a position in 1784 against the selling or imbibing of spirits, with a call for members to totally abstain, taking effect in 1789. Other churches, including the Presbyterian, the Universalists, Baptists, and Friends, also railed against consuming liquors. Delaware, due to a heavy Methodist population, was a very early of Prohibition. How early? After Maine passed the first Prohibition in 1847, Delaware soon followed, a year later, although it was declared unconstitutional the following year. It was after the Civil War, however, that the march toward Prohibition really began. It was part of a larger, intertwined social changes that were taking root throughout the country. Feminism, unionism, socialism, and progressivism, such as a belief in the civil service reform and better Native American policies, all were connected in some way to Prohibition. It continued to pick up speed in the 20th century with World War I contributing in a not-so-savory manner. The anger against Axis powers, especially Germany, didn't help beer manufacturers with their obvious German names like Schlitz, Blatz, and Pabst. Here in Delaware, though, the tide had already turned. Kent and Sussex County had already adopted Prohibition by 1907, and Newcastle County followed shortly afterwards. The city of Wilmington was the only wet area in the state when Prohibition was imposed in January of 1920. However, the fervor in the state continued even after it was imposed. For example, early in 1922, the Dover Ministerial Association asked the Dover City Council, headed by President McGee at the time, for more enforcement of the Volstead Act, which was the federal law that interpreted and imposed prohibition. The council demurred, saying that such enforcement was not really a city issue, but rather for the Attorney General to handle. And there were other cases in the area. One particularly enterprising person, Paul Josefowski of Westover, was sentenced to 4 months in prison for violating the Volstead Act. Mr. Josefowski had 3 stills in a cave under a chicken house on his property. I'm not sure, though, that this bust had a big input on liquor production in the area, though. When asked by the judge if he had made any liquor since his arrest, he said no, he hadn't. But he had been consuming a pint of liquor a week that it was given to him by his friends. And there were enough cases in the area, in fact, that federal agents were called in. And we read in 1929 that a renovation of the second floor of the old post office, now owned by Wesley Church, to make room for federal prohibition agents. And speaking of agents, Southern Delaware had a very colorful leadership in this era. Harold Three-Gun Wilson, named after an admirer, gave him a pair of pistols to add to the one he already carried, believed in 2 things: prohibition and publicity. He was described as a hard-boiled, Bible-quoting, relentless, dedicated prohibition agent, and he believed that the news of people in power being arrested for liquor violations was being suppressed. And he felt kind of strongly about that. Writing a few years later, he said, "Grab the contemptible, treacherous, poison hooch vendor by the nape of the neck and the seat of the pants and throw him in the jail where he belongs, and nothing in the world can prevent publicity." So, early in the Prohibition era, when he was appointed to the Massachusetts field office, it should come as no surprise that shortly afterwards, he led a raid on a New England hotel where liquor was being served to the guests, including the governor of Massachusetts. And while he didn't grab him by the nape of the neck, it didn't turn out too well for Three-Gun. He was fired and transferred to Nebraska, which probably was just as much of a punishment back then as it sounds today. Eventually, though, he made his way back, and late in the Prohibition era, he was appointed the Deputy Prohibition Director for Delaware. And he immediately set his sight on a couple of speakeasies downstate. Well, the first speakeasy apparently caught wind of it, and when he went to it in Delmar, there was nothing there. I'm giving you time to get over the concept of a speakeasy in Delmar. However, when he went to a similar place in Lewis, he found a 25-gallon still. And after giving a speech where he urged that local citizen groups be formed to report violators, he would leave southern Delaware and head up north, where he then managed to raid a party at a political club in Wilmington that was being hosted for the governor of Delaware. He managed to get himself arrested for contempt of court when he would not tell who had given him a key to the club and a map of the rooms of the club, which is where he used to find where they were at, and he went to jail. After he got out of jail, he was sent back to Nebraska for a second time. However, by this time, the tide had turned on the public's feelings of prohibition. While there were some who would continue to push for the enforcement of the law of the land, with one minister traveling through the state giving speeches where he equated disobedience with the Volstead Act with Bolshevism, or basically saying that the contempt of the law would lead to communism. it was definitely a definite turn in public opinion. The problems of Prohibition, which included a disdain for the law, higher crimes, and a social cost of what people thought were lower morals, Delaware became disillusioned. Reading through the papers, it seemed that many politicians were aware of the difficulties enforcing it, and state leaders, including Pierre S. Biranet and Alice DuPont, started to campaign for its repeal. When the appeal came to a vote, it was extremely popular, and Prohibition ended in 1933, a noble but failed experiment, although the Prohibition Party of Delaware continued to field candidates all the way up as late as 1940. Again, I hope you enjoyed this talk. We plan on doing something stretched out in a slightly different format of a walking tour of Dover this fall. Thank you very much.